Hello and welcome to another episode of Wheelsboy Chat, the show where we take time to sit down and have a more long-form discussion about topics related to the Chinese car industry. My guest, as is so often the case, and we're so grateful for that, is Mr. Mark Andrews.
Good to be back.
Very happy to have you again. The topic of today's discussion is one that I think is going to be close to the hearts of those of you who are interested in the tech side of Chinese cars. We are going to sit down and talk about what we think is the best Chinese advanced driver assistance system, ADAS. Self-driving, which is not a thing.
Autonomous driving.
Autonomous driving, right?
But we're not allowed to say those words.
We're not allowed to say those words for good reason, because they're not actually. Maybe I'll have a rant at the end of the video. But right now, we should start by talking about, we're going to focus on the four what we think are the leading brands in this realm. And so that's going to be NIO, Li Auto, well, we're going to call it Huawei because the Huawei system, Huawei Inside System is on multiple brands. And then finally, XPeng. So why don't we start actually with the Li Auto, because as it happens, we borrowed a Li Auto L9 this week.
It's parked right outside.
It's parked right outside of the office. I drove it not but a few hours ago for the first time, or drove the newest version of their NOA, that's navigation on autopilot. And so it's very fresh in our minds, so we'll talk about that first. You've been driving it for a few days.
Yes.
So you've had more time behind the wheel. Why don't you tell me your first impressions?
Well, first when I got in it, there was a little bit of a problem. It hadn't been set up correctly, so...
The system wasn't even turned on, was it?
Well, it was sort of turned on, but it wasn't turned on, so it would do things automatically.
Right.
And so a few missed it changes from like one gouger to another.
Yeah, from like one elevated
not
road.
Exiting and like, what's this doing?
So like you were, the specific situation you're describing is Mark's driving down an elevated road in Shanghai and needs to switch to another elevated road, and he's just waiting for the car to go and,
but instead of sitting in the fast lane, when's this car going to do anything?
And the answer was never.
Yeah.
But you opened the menu and you looked with the Li Auto people.
I was told, the people at the media place didn't have disengaged it. You need to engage it.
So it wasn't on. So having actually turned on the system, what were your impressions?
A lot better.
I would hope so, yes, starting with a low bar.
So, actually, from the time I got in the car, what really blew my mind was with the head-up display. Mm-hmm. And that is amazing. Mm-hmm. So you've got a huge head-up display, and it's really detailed. You get the sort of the information about what's around the car.
Kind of the images you think of when you see them on the center screen on Teslas, and it shows your little car and then the ghost cars and ghost people and ghost scooters around the vehicle. That is actually displayed on the very large heads-up display, which I don't want to throw a number out. It looks like it's quite a large
it's a large
HUD.
Display,
yeah. And so if I remember correctly, it's on the left side. It's got the navigation information, like your GPS info, your little map.
That's the right side when it shows up.
Okay.
So
Either
that's
way,
more in the middle, I think.
Well, let's not get bogged down in that. How about that? Let's just go. It's got your GPS info, so your turns and everything. It's got this ADAS display, and then it's obviously got all of your speed and your set speed for your cruise control and your stuff like that for the NOA. Yeah. It's really, really well done.
But anyway, to activate the NOA, basically you have to put in a location of where you're driving to, and there are basically two sort of self-driving modes. So you've got LKA, which is lane keep assistance, and you've got the NOA. So the NOA is the more capable of the two.
Right.
And when it's available, it will show up as LKA or NOA written in a gray circle.
I think this applies to pretty much all the systems we're going to talk to.
Yeah.
Once their individual logo appears, that's when you can activate it.
Yeah. Some of the logos are a little bit easier to understand than others.
Yes.
I would say the Lee's one is fairly obvious.
It's NOA or LKA or nothing.
Whereas XPeng's, for example,
we'll get to that
so
for sure.
So you just basically push down twice on the drive select. It will go into it. Now, I drove it on the highway. Actually, well, I've driven in both daytime and nighttime on the highway. And it generally behaved very, very well on the highway. Very good for highway driving. NOA largely only works really on highway and elevated roads within big cities.
Yeah, major cities.
So it cannot do just normal city roads currently.
We will, yes, but
supposedly in the second half of this year, they are going to have some sort of city driving capability all around China, which is not dependent on high definition mapping.
a big deal. Because
that's a big deal.
Other systems that we're going to discuss today, there's some flexibility to XPeng. We'll get to the details of that, XNGP. But they all do rely on high definition mapping currently. Which is why these systems will say, like, currently they can be used in Guangzhou, Shenzhen, Shanghai, major cities. Apart from that, you won't be able to, the list is different for each of them. You won't be able to activate them. So I wasn't able to use it as extensively as you were, but I completely agree about the HUD. I think it's one of the best ways to interpret the information. It's super clear, it's super crisp, it's bright.
Well, it keeps your eyes up as well.
And it keeps you in a safe kind of your eye line in a safe place. I thought lane changes were super smooth.
Yes.
I thought that the maintaining of the speed was very good.
Generally.
A simple thing, but there are some systems that really, really annoy me, and we're about to get to one, where I would set the speed at 80 and it would go 79, 80, 79, 80, 79, 80, 79, 80. It's probably just me that's very bothered by that, but it makes me feel like if you can't set just the speed at the exact speed, how am I supposed to trust that you're going to be able to do all the other harder stuff, even actually well? So NOA on highway, obviously we haven't been able to try later this year. We have learned, and by the time this video comes out, almost certainly they will have had a launch event for their NOA, city NOA.
Yeah, they're doing media test drives this month.
Right.
But when I actually asked about that, they couldn't tell me when it was actually going to go live for the public.
Yes.
So it's supposedly sometime in the second half of this year.
Right.
But they haven't got a specific date, at least that they've announced anyway.
Right.
One thing though I would say with NOA is that it's not always that good at maintaining speed.
Okay.
So I did have some issues with driving it on the highway.
Specifically, like you would set it at say 80 kilometers per hour, and it would let it shift, go down or up.
Well, the thing is, it will sometimes go into a lane. It's a lot of these systems have a tendency a bit to hog the middle lane.
Yes.
And they're often reluctant to go out into that outer lane.
Fast passing lane.
And actually pick up speed. Obviously you shouldn't really be doing undertaking maneuvers.
Like that kind?
Yeah, so they generally don't do that, but there is that issue. And yeah, I would say that was a bit of a problem. And one thing though that I was impressed by was with LKA, the lane keeper system, it does seem to have some capability of actually doing automated turns as well.
I wasn't able to.
Well, I thought you did earlier. Didn't you?
I was able to show that. No. There was something else that we noticed that it could actually do.
One also thing that it does do on the map is it shows you the countdown for the lights, and it shows you whether the lights are red or green. Which a lot of the other systems, well, for example, the Neo system, does not when it's in pilot. We'll get to that later.
Okay. Well, I mean, unless you've got any closing thoughts about NOA, I would say limited to highways, but
I think the biggest issue I had with it.
Yeah. Let's talk about. There's always problems. What were your problems?
On 2 occasions, it tried to cross a solid white line.
You told me, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So it tried to do it. I overrode it. That knocked me out of the system. Put it back in, and it immediately tried to do the same thing.
No good.
Yeah.
Tons of traffic cameras here in China that will very likely get caught and fined.
The reason was that it was trying to turn off, but there was a solid white line there, so it should really have actually gone about doing the maneuver far earlier than it did. And I think that was the problem. It was really too much doing it at the last minute.
Right. I would say that there was the only incident that I had that had me really butt puckering was when we were going from one branch of the elevated road to another one, and we had to merge on, and this was under NOA, and basically you merge straight onto this road, but the opening, so to speak, onto the other elevated road, there was these almost like a hashed line that the car, I was looking at it as the car was going up to it, I was like, is this going to think that it wants to go this way, but there's a wall here? So that's exactly what happened, right? It starts to approach that, like the squares on the road there, they were kind of showing where you could merge onto the road, and it kind of started to follow those, and I do not know that, I'm not going to be able to tell you that it would have for sure hit the wall, because I wasn't going to find out. But I intervened before, but it got very close and made myself and my other passenger very nervous. So with that out of the way, so first one, Li Auto, NOA, highway and elevated roads only, but overall, pretty good performance.
Yeah,
pretty good performance for that.
Impressive.
Impressive. We'll rank them at the end. How about that? Number 2, Neo.
Right.
Specifically NOP Plus, which we drove the ET7 together.
Yeah, so I had it for quite a few days, a few months ago.
We were given mixed information. So probably a month ago or so, you had a Neo ET7 that you borrowed in order to, a few weeks ago, to drive because you were doing an article about these ADAS systems, comparing them. One of the reasons we're talking about this now, yeah. And so we drove that car together. And then, not but a week or so later, we went to Beijing to drive the ES6.
Yeah, so we were both there, around about the end of last month, I think.
Right, 17th to 18th of May, I was in Beijing to drive that car, where we used a version of NOP Plus that I was told at the time was actually not yet available to the public, but Mark was told at the time that the version he had driven in the ET7 some weeks before was indeed the most updated version. So who knows?
Yeah.
All I can say is...
certainly the operating system was updated in the ES6.
The Banyan, yes.
The Banyan was not available in the other cars.
No.
But I was told that there was little to no difference between the NOP. That's what I was told.
So we'll assume these are one system, and we'll critique them based on that. I wasn't particularly impressed.
Well, did you notice any difference between the ET7 and the ES6 experience? Because I didn't.
You had much more time in the ET7 than I did. We had the same amount of time, I would say, in the ES6. I felt as though, with the limited amount of time that I had in the ET7, it doesn't feel fair necessarily to judge the system purely based on that, based on, let's say, 40 minutes that I was driving it. Because all these systems really are dependent on the road conditions, and it could be that any of the other systems that we drove, you threw them in the same thing, they may have responded as in poor ways like this one did. My complaints about the car with the ET7, and I think we had the same ones, very hesitant to lane change, right? Very skittish, right? A nervous teenager. So you're driving behind a car at well below the speed limit for way too long.
It's really not good at maximizing its speed.
No.
That was one thing I found the Neo system really poor at.
Right. So reading the road ahead and saying, I'm currently going 100 kilometers per hour. This car in front of me is going 85. Free lane, free lane. If I just go and move over, I'll get around it. Instead, this system and a lot of these systems will pull up behind a car, sit there for a while, and then finally make up its mind to go around. At which point, maybe the traffic behind you is already caught up, so then it can't move over.
Certainly, I found with the Li, you could override it by just doing the indicator light, and then it would actually just go out and do it. But
was that not the case with the Neo?
I don't seem to think it was. I think I actually had to manually do it, if I can remember correctly, but I may be wrong about that.
So in that respect, I wasn't... The ES6, I drove the ES6 outside of, we both drove in the same place, which is north of Beijing, heading towards the Great Wall.
Yeah, it was around the Great
Wall. Where it was essentially empty highways.
Yeah,
very light traffic.
Relatively light, yeah.
Certainly when we were there, I think I was there on a Friday, you were there on a weekend?
Yeah, we were there a few days later, or a few weeks later, I think.
Well, yeah, you were there a little bit. Yeah. Either way, it definitely felt like very light traffic, oftentimes empty highway. And I still felt like the system wasn't that confident with lane keeping, with making little adjustments that felt...
I drove the ET7 quite a long distance when I had it. And in fact, I drove within the course of 2 days or so forth, I actually drove probably about somewhere approaching 200 kilometers.
Right.
mainly using the system. And I generally felt it worked reasonably well.
Right.
However, what I really had a problem with Neo was the pilot. So when it's not on NOP, it has a system called Pilot. Which
this is the equivalent of Li Auto's LKA.
Yeah, so it's basically a lane keeping assistant stroke adaptive cruise control. However, it just doesn't really keep to the lanes very well. It has very jerky steering movements. Again, when we mentioned that, the NOP is not very good at maximizing speed or maintaining speed or whatever. Pilot is really bad at that. Also, there was nothing like traffic light recognition. So basically, you would have to definitely stop it, and it wouldn't realize when the traffic lights were counting down or anything like that. You had to do pretty much everything.
Because LKA and Pilot both can be operated in city environments, but I would argue they're still not appropriate for those environments.
And there's not much advantage really with using them in those situations.
Not really. They're still pretty dummy systems.
Yeah.
So with NOP, one of the things I had an issue with, and I think you did too, was that it was, and I never had this happen with NOA. Maybe you can tell me about NOA. NOP was dropping out left and right on me.
Right.
Constantly saying like NOP is exited NOP. We're now in Pilot. So downgrading the system while you're driving it because it has very strict standards for when it can operate, which in some ways is a safety feature, which I appreciate. So I don't want to make it sound as though I don't understand why they do that. There is a method to that. Though I would argue that all these things are really just to protect the company's liability rather than to protect any consumers or drivers. But anyways, wink, wink, hint, hint, And so that happened to me in Beijing in circumstances that I could not easily explain. It wasn't that the system was overwhelmed.
Well, again, that goes back to the high definition mapping. Supposedly, this area is not mapped by high definition mapping, and so
but
that's why it's cutting
we'd
out.
have like 200 meters.
Yeah, precisely, like the 200-meter ghost area.
Yes, of ghost area.
Yeah.
So I didn't really particularly.
It did happen to me with the Li, but especially in Shanghai on the Gouger, there are elements.
Elevated road.
Yeah, the elevated
he keeps
road,
using Chinese.
Sorry, I've been here too long. So there are sections where that is the case, and again with the Li, it was doing that, but you didn't get such a discernible difference between the LKA and the NOA, so it didn't seem to be such an issue. With the Neo, there's such a difference between the capability of the NOP and Pilot. You're like, get me out of Pilot as soon as it goes in it, because it's frustrating and annoying and everything. You just do not want it on.
Right.
Whereas LKA, yeah, it's not as good as NOA, but it's okay.
It doesn't have as many.
It's not as annoying.
It doesn't have as many functions. It doesn't have the automatic overtaking and stuff necessarily.
Yeah.
So I would say let's put those two behind us and talk about what are the currently until Li Auto and Neo release their city self-driving systems, at least the most capable systems. That would be the Huawei Inside and the XNGP. Now, quickly, I will talk about Huawei Inside because this is the one of the four that not both of us have driven. We are one of some of the few people who have driven this many of these systems and then can talk at length about them. And so Huawei Inside I have tried twice. The first time, I say it's most capable because it and XNGP both have both highway and city navigation on autopilot. So Huawei Inside I've driven in 2 different cars in 2 different cities. The first time I drove it was in a Arcfox Alpha S, hence the model there in front of us, here in Shanghai when they did release their system. I then drove it when the Avatr 1.1 in the city of Chongqing. I have to say, very impressive. The good stuff. The inputs, i.e. braking, steering, accelerating, very, very smooth. Particularly braking, I was impressed by. It was not very often that I found myself in a situation where I felt like the car over-braked, which these more immature systems absolutely will do. They're like, again, they're like an untrained teenage driver. They're just like all the brake pedal's an on-off switch. So not a problem with the Huawei Inside system. Merging, turning, all of it was very smooth. Now, the main weakness that I found with Huawei Inside was, much like NOA, in the city specifically, it would frequently exit the system. And so what that means is that it would encounter traffic situations. Let's say I needed to go, I had about 150 meters to get over to the right-hand lane so that I could take a dedicated right-hand turn lane onto a major road. It would say, you know, we're exiting, you know, Huawei Inside, or Avatrans is what Avatr calls their system. The people at Avatr they admitted to me, I was like, what is that? Avatrans, AVTRANS, and they go, it's got to have an English name, so we just gave it that. So that system would say, you know, exiting this NOA system, and now you need to take over. So it knew, I can't handle this, you take over. But that happened not infrequently.
Right. I think all these systems do. I mean,
for differing reasons and in different conditions. In those situations, it rarely happened with Huawei Inside that it happened where I just didn't understand why. So both in Shanghai and Chongqing, which have pretty complex road situations, especially Chongqing, they were able to be very smooth and confident, and I felt, just as an example, the way that the Huawei Inside system makes way for someone, for example, who is parked their electric scooter on the side of the road, who's in the lane a little bit, but not in the middle of the lane. It was very naturally able to make enough space and put in enough turning input that I knew was comfortable that it was going to make space for this car, but without going into the lane next to me or making me feel like it was overcorrecting in any way. So big points for that, but very sensitive to road conditions. Again, this is for liability reasons, I'm sure. So I do give it high marks, but let's get to our final entrant.
I think one thing with Huawei, we should point out that basically it's a little bit different to the other companies we're talking about in that they're actually giving it to a number of different car companies.
Yes,
so it's not actually dependent on one car company. That's why Ethan's actually experienced it in cars from 2 different companies.
It's a system.
So it's basically a third party, Huawei has come in and is offering this to manufacturers who want to use their system rather than developing their own systems.
Right. And also something else about the Huawei system, and thank you for reminding me, is that it has triple LiDAR. The Huawei system, as opposed to, just to go really quickly over the specs of the cars we're talking about, the Li Auto and the Neo both have a single LiDAR unit that is mounted over the windshield. Then you have the Huawei Inside system on the Avatr 1.1 and the Arcfox Alpha S, which, maybe we can get some pictures in the model here, but we actually have real footage of the car when we drove it. There are 2 side-mounted, one on either side, forward of the front wheels, I believe. No, actually,
I think they're in the light mounting
they're,
with the
Avatr.
With the Arcfox.
They're behind the rear wheels, I think. Regardless, one on each side, one on the front, mounted relatively low, and then XNGP, which we'll get to in a moment, has them on the bumpers, either side of the bumper.
The light cluster.
The light cluster, correct.
Yeah.
So the Huawei Inside is unique in that it is a triple LiDAR system. So it has a much wider, in theory, angle or field of view, and it seems to make use of that. Let's move to XNGP, our final one, before we do our ranking. So you and I, did you drive CNGP?
No, I haven't.
So I will briefly talk a bit about the fact that we were both recently in Beijing, or Guangzhou, I'm sorry, to drive the XPeng G6 with the latest version of XNGP. Also available on the P7i, which is how you used it.
Yes.
And XNGP, previously known as X-Pilot, then a bunch of different names, and now
X-Pilot is actually, I think, the hardware.
Okay.
I think.
Is it still called X-Pilot, though?
I'm not sure. They keep.
Irregardlessly, the XNGP, we both drove it in Guangzhou, and I drove it, however, a kind of beta version of this latest XNGP that they called City NGP, navigation.
Well, City NGP was a previous version, something that they brought out with the P5.
As a beta test for a limited release, I believe. Yeah,
I'm not really sure.
Yeah, they're all a little bit, we're giving it to people. How many? You know, some of them. So I went to Guangzhou back in the summer of last year to drive CNGP, City Navigation Guided Pilot, in a XPeng P5 sedan. And my experience with that was very impressive. It was the opposite of the Huawei Inside system in that its inputs were poor. It was a bad braker. It was not, it made turns pretty well, but it would also had a nasty habit of running straight through some yellow lights. I don't know if XNGP, I didn't get to see if XNGP, the latest version, did this, but with CNGP, myself and my videographer who was in the car the whole time were like, oh, it's going, it's going, it's going. Legally, we were fine, but it was a little bit more brave than I wanted my driver assistance system to be. But overall, a pretty impressive first impression.
You're still paying off the fines, aren't you?
Still paying off the fines, yeah. I had to take it a loan. But let's bring us now to our final system, and the one that you drove it on a P7i here in Shanghai.
Yes, and also in the G6 in Guangzhou as well.
And we both drove it in the G6 recently when we were there in Guangzhou to review it. How do I say this?
A Tale of Two Cities?
A Tale of Two Cities. First, tell us about your impression of Shanghai and the P7i.
Well, I thought it was great. Yeah, I actually should point out there's two elements to the XNGP and etc. So XNGP currently only works in Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Shenzhen.
Yes.
Now, even within those cities, sometimes there is an area which can only operate as I think it's LCC, which is
lane.
I don't think it's
caressing.
Lane. It's not caressing.
No, I don't think so.
it's
lane cruise control.
I think lane keeping cruise control or something like that.
Keep with a C.
Whatever.
There's guys, please forgive us. There's too many abbreviations.
And this is not a very obvious one.
I have a dictionary.
Yeah, it's not a very obvious one. But anyway, with that, it's no longer dependent on high definition mapping.
Right.
The XNGP currently is dependent on the high definition mapping. So in the areas outside, it will do this LCC thing. Now, that definitely has traffic light recognition.
Yes.
So it will brake and come to a standstill if the light is red. And it's actually quite good at going pretty much as soon as it goes green or go off.
Right, but it won't turn, right?
It will not turn.
Right.
It will go through a light if it's green and whatever, or go straight but cannot turn. Again, press down twice to activate it. And once it goes into an area where it's possible to do the City NGP part of XNGP, it'll automatically go into that. So when I drove it around Shanghai, I was generally really quite impressed. I didn't really have to intervene much at all. I got a little bit, one situation, I got a bit disorientated. I thought the car was disoriented. I think it was just me, actually. I think the car knew exactly where it was going.
Smarter than you.
Yeah, I think it was my fault that. There were a couple of weird decisions it made with regard to lanes. So one time we did a U-turn, and then immediately had to go down into a tunnel, and it should have just gone into the lane directly for the tunnel. But it should have,
instead of U-turning into the closest lane on the other side, it should have U-turned to a farther lane.
Well, we went to a different lane, then we had to change into the correct lane, which was to the right, whereas it should have just gone into that lane and made a smooth transition.
Right.
So there were a few things, and also it did once go over a white line. So I went going back to the Lee thing, and this was on a highway again. Yeah. So it announced like it was making preparations to go for the exit.
Yeah.
And it normally said that, but it didn't necessarily take action straight away. And this time it just did action straight away. It was like, naughty, you shouldn't have done that. But those are pretty much the only problems I had in Shanghai.
In Shanghai. Now, let's talk about Guangzhou, because XNGP we had a drive from Chongqing, where the racetrack was for that event, to Guangzhou, And Guangzhou, that was about an hour.
How was it on the highway for you?
Fine.
Yeah, I thought it worked really well from Zhaoqing to Guangzhou on the highway.
On par with NOP, certainly. On par with NOA from Li Auto. You know, confident. It made lane changes much more confidently and quickly, and in literally like tighter spaces with cars behind than CNGP had done, or than I experienced.
Well, CNGP was always in the city, so
True. Sorry. As I was later found out it would do that in the city too. But either way, it felt more confident. Inputs were much smoother than they were with previous systems and stuff.
Yeah, because they used to have Highway NGP. That was
right.
the previous system under the X-Pilot 3.0.
Which we tried with our XPeng P7 review back in 2021. 2020. I think it's 2021.
Yeah, it would have been 2021. It was like January.
Long time ago. So long ago I had to yawn when I thought about it. The system was good on the highway, but once we got in the city,
oh boy,
good Lord, surprisingly bad. Just straight up, I like to put this in a polite way, but it just wasn't good. It felt erratic. It felt the steering inputs were really sharp. The braking was really sudden. The near misses were many. I just did not have any confidence in that system, almost at all. To the point where I said, okay, well, I would maybe drive this in very congested traffic as essentially a traffic assist system.
I was so much more relaxed driving back from the Opera House to the hotel by myself.
Absolutely.
Than trying to monitor the system.
Absolutely.
And it was so much smoother.
Absolutely. And it was surprising because I have high expectations for XPeng and for their systems.
Me too, because I'd experienced it in Shanghai.
I bet it was
like
even more.
I was like, really, I couldn't believe it. Because
is this the same system even?
Yeah, that's why I said it's Tale of Two Cities.
Yes.
And one thing I think that might have made a difference is with Shanghai, you have a fair amount of segregation between types of traffic.
Yeah.
So you have generally a lane for bicycles, e-bikes, that often even has a physical barrier between them.
Yes, there's a median.
There's
a median of some kind.
At the very least, a white line. Mm-hmm. Whereas in Guangzhou, it seemed to be that it was far more mixed, that the bikes and bicycles were in the same lanes.
Yes.
And I think that caused part of the problem.
I think so.
And also, I think with all these systems, what causes an issue essentially is other drivers as well. That always causes a big problem.
Correct. One of the things about XNGP that bothered me the most, and this was as close as I could get to figuring out why it was doing this, is that it would exit the system out. One of the things about CNGP is that you can watch my video about it, but there were a couple of circumstances where I intervened because I just was like, the system's not going to know what to do with this. I don't want to wait for it. But it didn't exit the system very frequently. NOA, well, first of all, the Huawei Inside system exited quite a bit more. But then NOA exited frequently, but not because the system said, I don't know how to handle this. Because, again, this is as far as I could tell, with the thing about the XPeng system, when you hold a steering wheel in a car, you don't, as a naturally go like this and daintily, gently hold it. You also don't feel comfortable doing this, especially when the system was as unstable, as far as I could tell, as it was. So I was holding the steering wheel in a normal way. Now, unfortunately, what that meant was I was applying enough pressure and torque on the steering wheel to make the system feel comfortable that I was engaged, but it was also too much for the motors in the steering wheel to overcome in order to make a lane change on its own, which it was frequently doing in the city, in traffic.
It kept kicking us out of the system.
And that was because, essentially, it thought I was canceling the lane change because the weight of my hands on the steering wheel was too much for it to handle. And so it thought I was resisting it, and it decided to just quit. And that happened so many times before I figured out what it was.
And I think one thing that's worth pointing out also, when you're in city driving with these systems, the wheel tends to be spinning all around, and you can't really keep your hands on it. It's like going really fast, like, oh gosh.
Yeah, which is why when you see the driving videos and stuff with the engineers, is they have their hands on the bottom like this, so they can grab and take control. but not in a way that's in the way of the wheel. But again, I wasn't confident enough in the system to actually do that. With Huawei Inside, I was. And so maybe that's why I'd never had this problem with the Huawei Inside system, is because I never had to grab the wheel so hard. So overall, surprising, I was disappointed. I'm afraid to say I was disappointed. So let's rank these now. Keeping in mind that only 2 of the systems currently have city capability, the Huawei Inside and the XNGP. Let's be fair and.
Well, shall we talk about which is best for highway then?
Let's just say highway, and then we will then pick a round for Huawei Inside versus XNGP. Huawei-wise, highway-wise, I would say it's a toss-up between NOA and. To be fair, I didn't get to use the Huawei Inside system that much on the highway because it was the city experience. I was really mostly only using it on very on elevated roads at best, and in that situation it was very reliable. But I would say I'm gonna demur and not actually try to judge it based on that. But I would say it would be toss up between XNGP and NOA. Li Auto and XPeng.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Right.
Yeah,
and so either one of those I would take. I think let's say XNGP, then the NOA from Li Auto, and then we'll say we won't put the Huawei Inside because we haven't really tested it that much. But and then NOP in my opinion. Simply because of the issues of constantly quitting out of the system.
I mean, definitely NOA and XNGP are much better at highway driving, in my experience.
Yes.
I'm not saying NOP's bad.
No.
But
useful.
It's
useful.
For
sure.
Yeah, completely usable.
On a long road trip.
Particularly on a long journey, completely usable.
Enough to help you to be relaxed.
Oh yeah, very much so. Yeah.
So then let's get to the other question, which is Huawei Inside versus XNGP. Now, keeping in mind that you haven't actually driven Huawei Inside, I would say that in terms of the regular use, the Huawei Inside is better. Meaning I felt more comfortable in both driving situations with Huawei Inside than I did with XNGP. I would say then again, my experiences were, I would say, very similar to what you described here in Shanghai with XNGP. But my experience in Guangzhou made me really, really doubt the capabilities of that system, at least in those circumstances. And so I would say Huawei Inside and then XNGP.
Yeah, well, I have no idea because I haven't driven Huawei Inside, but as I said, the experience I had in Shanghai was so much different to Guangzhou.
Well,
unbelievable.
Both of them have their issues, but actually, you know what? I'm gonna flip my order. I'm gonna say XNGP is the better one, and Huawei Inside isn't as good. And there's one reason for that.
What's that?
Safety. Because while Huawei Inside was a more reliable system, XNGP had more obvious and frequent safety protocols. Specifically, XNGP is the only system of the four that we're talking about that monitors your eye line, i.e. Cadillac Super Cruise, which is, in my opinion, the only safe way to use one of these systems. The other ones only use steering, like torque input on the steering wheel. And the XNGP was much more frequently required you to apply torque to the steering wheel than those other systems. Now, that did result in the poor behavior that I discussed, where it constantly exited the system because I had to apply enough torque to let it know I was driving it, but that was too much torque for it to make a lane change.
Yeah.
So that is an issue, I think, of programming and tuning that could be resolved. But on the base layer,
the strange thing is though, I didn't have it exiting much in Shanghai, whereas I did in Guangzhou, and I'm really not exactly sure why.
I really think it had to do. The only guess I can make is it has to do with the way we were driving it, right? So, but then that's the thing. I really want to congratulate XPeng on the fact that they've made what I think is the system with the strictest, most safety-oriented system. So while there are serious issues that I have with it, they have a baseline level of safety that they can work with so that people on the road and drivers can be safe while they continue to improve it. Versus the other systems which felt more confident, Huawei Inside specifically. But I feel like they could do more to make it safer and harder to use irresponsibly. How about that? So just as a conclusion, because I know we have a bit of a differing opinion on this, would you, if you had one of those cars, let's say a Huawei Insider XNGP, and saying your Shanghai experience of it, not your Guangzhou experience, how often do you think you would use it?
I think in the city, I would use it actually sometimes, yeah.
I would not. because I just don't, I've never had a system, even as good as I've described the Huawei Inside system being, I've never had a system that I used where I was like, this is better than, less stressful than me just driving the car myself. Apart from super specific circumstances like very dense traffic where the car literally just has to go forward and stop, forward and stop, forward and stop.
And sometimes these systems actually freak out. In
and
that kind
sometimes
of,
they don't handle that
area.
very well, even then. So I don't think I would actually use them. So, you know, I think that's a pretty comprehensive look at the existing systems. You know, maybe we'll do an updated version of this sometime once we've driven NOA City. We can do a full-on city comparison with the Li Auto version. And
also, one thing we should point out with XPeng, they're supposedly going to be rolling this out across the country in the second half of this year, and it will no longer be dependent on high definition mapping.
They will use what it's like XNet or something like that.
Yeah.
Basically, it's a system that uses it
creates its own map essentially.
It creates
what's around it using its sensors.
Sensor fusion to create a high definition map as it goes.
And essentially, that's what the the Li system, not the Neo system. The Li system will also be doing the same. So what Li is going to be rolling out and what they're doing the media test drives of later this month is also based on a similar sort of theory, from what I understand.
So it sounds like there's going to be some improvements, you know, in the future and stuff, and
very
shortly, hopefully we'll be able to try those soon. In the meantime, I think that's going to do it for today's discussion. If you look at the time, it's been probably quite a long one. It's probably the longest one we've done recently, but there's a lot to talk about. Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to let us know in the comments, have you used any of these systems if you're here in China? Would you use, or do you use them if you are someone who's based in another country? But there are obviously systems made by non-Chinese companies, from Cadillac Super Cruise to Tesla and their autopilot and FSD and stuff. You know, leave your comments below. We're always interested to see what you guys have to think about our videos, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.